First, Matt, I thought I wanted to get your thoughts on when do you feel this conflict started? Was it in February or was it before that? And was it justified?
Well, I mean, I think it's you'd be hard pressed to pick an actual start date, right? In the sense of the divisions between, excuse me, Russians and Ukrainians. That if you're a historian of the era or just a general, just have the general knowledge, understand that this goes back centuries, and you can see that in the way that both sides, the Russians and the Ukrainians, point to things that predate us
Yeah.
by generations. So I think for a Western audience, an audience in the UK, an audience in the United States, a NATO audience, if you will, I think the appropriate point is probably to begin after the dissolution of the Soviet Union. And then the relationship between the United States, particularly, and Russia, that gets very difficult through the 90s because of, as the Russians would say, the American looting and plundering of Eastern Europe and Russia. And I mean, so obviously I say this with a grain of salt in the sense that there are always multiple sides to every story. But in the case of, say, this antagonism that arises from the Russians over the American actions in the years following the breakup of the Soviet Union, I think there's a lot of justification for that, and there's certainly a ton of evidence that the Americans came in, American bankers came in and tried to loot Russia, there's people will discuss how this, and in the American placing of Boris Yeltsin, as the leader of Russia, that humiliation Russians felt. There's a lot of argumentation that says this is how you end up with a Vladimir Putin.
Mm-hmm.
And also, too, though, it's you have to remember, though, if you go back 20 some odd years, 22 years or so, you will see in the American press a fawning admiration for Vladimir Putin, that this is the guy who's going to right Russia. And you go and you look and you see, particularly the years 2000, 2001, 2002, how the American press spoke highly of him. But then you start to get into the Bush years. You start to get into disagreements over particularly missile defense,
Mm-hmm.
the withdrawal by the Bush administration from the anti-ballistic missile treaty, which was nothing other than billions upon billions, tens upon tens of billions of dollars of giveaways to the American military industrial complex. You had the continued enlargement of NATO, which occurred all throughout the 90s, continued into the early parts of the century, in a way, in a manner that the list of American and European diplomats, former politicians, generals, whoever, said this is dangerous, this is wrong. You are going to cross some very real Russian red lines here, and the consequences are not worth the expansion of NATO. The consequences are not worth the ability of you to sell eventually F-35s to Ukraine, or because I think a lot of us look at the expansion of NATO as the primary goal being that expansion of U.S. and European military sales into Eastern Europe. So, I mean, you have all this, and you have quite clearly where the Russians pushed back in 2007 and 2008, whether it be at the Munich Security Conference in 2007 or at the NATO conference in 2008 in Romania, where the Russians, through their president, Vladimir Putin, quite clearly are saying, look, this is a red line for us. This is, you are crossing into, you are contemplating something here that we cannot accept. This is a danger to us. So you continue to have all those types of what you would say provocations, instigations, pushing, bullying. I mean, that is how the Russians would depict it as, and I think objective observers take that view as well, including, again, many men and women And the list is long. Kissinger, Talbot, Albright, Kennan. I mean, the list is quite long of American former government officials, diplomats, military officers, whoever, who warned against such a thing as provoking a war in Ukraine. And then, of course, you fast forward to 2014. You have the overthrow of the elected government of Ukraine that if the Americans were not fully involved, they were certainly supporting. There's a lot of evidence for that, including a leaked telephone call between the head of the American European Affairs for the State Department, Victoria Nuland, and the American ambassador to Ukraine, Jeffrey Pyatt. So there's a lot of those types of events. At the same time, the pushing that was going on around the world against Russia. So not just the actions in Ukraine, but as well as the expansion of the missile defense systems from Romania into Poland, the expansion of the American army into back into Europe, coming out of Afghanistan and Iraq, putting more troops back into Europe. Commentary from Washington, D.C., as well as London, that the Russians, depending on who is talking, sometimes they say the Chinese, but the Russians are our threat. These wars in the Middle East were a mistake. They are a distraction. The real threat has been and always will be Russia or China, depending upon. Sometimes they say both, right? I mean, so you had all these things, and then you had the war in Syria, where the West was trying to overthrow Russia's ally, and Russia said stop or we'll intervene. In 2015, they intervened and they kept Assad in power. And the same thing too. You had these occurrences, say, with the war in Georgia, where there's a lot of American involvement in that, a lot of American support for Georgia going to war with Russia. In the summer of 2008, John McCain, who's the Republican presidential contender, or the Republican presidential nominee in the U.S., is fiercely advocating for the U.S. to enter into that war between Georgia and Russia. I mean, that would have been madness. That would have been absolute madness. And so you had it's one of those kind of sense of all the type of rhetoric, the pushing, the bullying, as the Russians would describe it, that leads up to 2014, the coup, and then of course Russia responds by taking Crimea and by supporting an insurgency or a civil war in the eastern part of Ukraine. And then, of course, you have years of that civil war. You have an agreement in 2015, the Minsk II agreement, that brings violence down quite a bit, particularly among civilians. So
Can you explain what the Minsk agreement was and the party?
Sure. There's a Minsk I and then finally a Minsk II, which I think was agreed upon in March of 2015. So about a year or so into the fighting in eastern Ukraine, this agreement was between Russia and Ukraine, but had a heavy role played by the Germans and the French. And then the Americans really dragged their feet on it. In Washington, D.C., there was a very real degree, a really real sense that this is not what we want. And this was at the time that the American administration, the Obama administration, was under heavy pressure to send weapons to Ukraine to really, and the Minsk II agreements between Russia and Ukraine were such that one, there'd be ceasefires, but then the other parts of it were the political parts, which is ultimately what the wars and most or all wars are about, the politics of it. And so it was the neutrality of the eastern Ukraine, basically creating eastern Ukraine into a semi-autonomous zone. And you had neutrality overall for Ukraine as well. That in Ukraine, these were the kind of things that the Russians have wanted. This, I think, was fairly reasonable for a lot of people, particularly in Europe. Both sides were not great about implementing the agreement, but it worked to a degree. In the years running up to the February 2022 invasion by Russia, so a year ago, in those parts that started to fall apart, and particularly in the year prior to the invasion, you saw an increase in violence and increase, say, in artillery shelling or whatnot. But for most of the years from 2015 up until then, that agreement largely held. Of course, there was still violence, but if you look at the numbers of casualties, the 15,000 people killed prior to the February 22 invasion by Russia, uh, you have most of those deaths occurring in the first year or so of the conflict, before Minsk II was really implemented. So it was successful in many ways, and there was a path forward. It wasn't a perfect path, but it was a path forward that, if all sides had adhered to, I don't believe these circumstances would be in place now, where you have this absolutely catastrophic and pointless war that is, ruining the lives of tens of millions of people. Has killed God knows how many, and the great fear, of course, is that it will escalate, and wars are breeding grounds for unintended consequences. And so, what will come out of a further escalation of the war is something that nobody knows. Anyone who tells you they know where this war is going, they're either complete fools or they're lying to you. There's probably on either side a handful of officers on either side who have a good picture of what's happening in this war. And so anyone who's talking to you with like certainty that this is going to happen, they don't know. I mean, the only certainty is that if it escalates, it will escalate in a manner that's not controllable, right? Not unknowable, right? The consequences may be worse than anything you could have predicted, and certainly look at all the different cases of war throughout the world. Look at the American experiences, with the wars in Iraq and the wars in Afghanistan, the wars in Syria, the escalation of those wars, what that brought about, the escalation of the war in Libya. What did that war bring about? So, I think that you get to this point now where we're almost a year into the war, and we're in this deadly I'm sitting here drinking coffee in North Carolina, but the Ukrainians and Russians are in this awful stalemate where either side will make advances. And now, I mean, being discussed, this Russian looks like near Russian victory in Soledar and Bakhmut. Now we all know these cities, right? We all know these cities and towns of regions that a year ago I would have thought that was a misspelling of Baku or something like that, right? But Bakhmut, and I mean, so we're all like now these experts, and we don't know anything about it. And I think we have to approach this with a humility that we don't really understand what's happening there, because it's such a heavy propagandized war. It's so difficult to get good reporting, get good information. I think the best thing we can do is try and understand what's occurring there and temper it with what we know about past wars, or what we know that conflict is like, with what we know that war is like, and try and use that to get an understanding of what has been occurring and where it might go.